Jimmy Boyle didn't just assault a prison officer. He threw industrial acid directly into the man's face, permanently blinding him. And then, in what seemed like madness, the Scottish Prison Service gave him a knife. This is the story of a man who embodied violence so completely that even hardened criminals feared him. A convicted murderer who terrorized Scotland's most secure prisons. But it's also the story of an experiment one that asked a dangerous question. Can art save someone who seems beyond saving? James Boyle was born in 1944, in the shadow of post-war Glasgow. The Gorbals, Black Hill, names that meant something if you knew Glasgow. Tenements packed tight, families stacked on top of each other, the smell of damp and smoke mixing with whatever was cooking for tea. This wasn't poverty, this was beyond that. This was a place where violence wasn't exceptional. It was currency. By his teens, Boyle was already known. Not famous, known. The way a feral dog gets known in a neighborhood. He left school early, like most boys did. There was no point staying, no jobs waiting, just the streets, the gangs, and the unspoken rule that if you didn't establish yourself, someone else would establish you. He chose the former. Assault, weapons charges, armed robbery. His record grew like a shopping list, each conviction more serious than the last. But it wasn't the crimes themselves that made people remember Jimmy Boyle. It was the way he committed them. No hesitation, no restraint, just raw, unfiltered aggression that seemed to come from somewhere primal. The police knew him. The courts knew him. And by the early 1970s, every prison in Scotland knew him too. But what happened next would change everything and cost a man his sight. By 1967, Boyle wasn't just another Glasgow hard man. He was building something, not a legitimate business, an empire of fear. Protection rackets, armed robberies that netted thousands, money laundering through bookies and pubs where questions weren't asked. He was grafting, as they said in Glasgow, making real money, the kind that bought respect and silence in equal measure. He moved between Glasgow's underworld with the confidence of someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him. And for a while they didn't. Witnesses forgot what they'd seen. Police files went missing. Boyle seemed untouchable, protected by a combination of fear and the criminal code that governed Glasgow's schemes. But in that world, there was always someone else coming up. Always another hard man who thought he was harder. Hugh Babs. Rooney was one of those men. The details of what happened between Boyle and Rooney remain disputed. What's not disputed is that on a night in 1967, Rooney was murdered, stabbed multiple times in a frenzied attack that spoke of personal rage, not business. The police investigation pointed directly at Jimmy Boyle. Boyle always denied it. I was convicted of something I did not do, he would say years later, but I was guilty of far worse. That statement should terrify you. Because if Boyle didn't kill Rooney, what were the things he did do? In 1977, a jury didn't care about his denials. They found him guilty. Murder, life imprisonment. At just 23 years old, Jimmy Boyle was told he would likely die in prison, and for a while, it seemed he was determined to prove them right. Barliney Prison, 1977, built in the Victorian era, designed to break men through isolation and routine. But Jimmy Boyle didn't break. He exploded. Within weeks of arriving, he'd assaulted another prisoner, then another. Guards who tried to restrain him found themselves targets of a violence so sudden and complete that transfer requests flooded the prison administration. Boyle was moved between institutions like a dangerous animal being passed from zoo to zoo. Stabbings, self-harm protests where he'd cut himself just to force the system to react, attacks on guards that left men hospitalized. The Scottish prison service had a problem. They had a prisoner they couldn't control and couldn't release. Then came the acid attack. The details are stark. During a confrontation with a prison officer, Boyle threw industrial acid directly into the man's face. The officer screamed. Other guards rushed in, but the damage was done. Permanent, total. The officer was left blind, his life fundamentally altered by 3 seconds of violence. Boyle was now officially labeled the most violent prisoner in Scotland, possibly in all of Britain. He was kept in near constant isolation. Some guards refused to work his wing. The system had tried punishment. It had tried isolation. It had tried everything except one thing, and that's when someone had a radical idea. The Barley Special Unit was an experiment born of desperation. In the late 1970s, progressive prison reformers convinced the Scottish prison service to try something that seemed insane. Take the most violent, unmanageable prisoners and give them autonomy. Not freedom. Autonomy. The difference mattered. The unit was small. A separate wing where prisoners had access to art materials, tools, and relative freedom of movement. They could wear their own clothes, cook their own food. But more than that, they were treated like human beings capable of change, not animals to be caged. The gamble was obvious. Give violent men tools, literally, knives and chisels and hammers, and hope they don't use them as weapons. The critics were immediate and loud. "You're rewarding criminals," they said. "This is a holiday camp." But the reformers had a theory that violence wasn't the core of these men. It was the language they'd learned because no other language worked. Jimmy Bole was selected for the unit. The most violent prisoner in Scotland was about to be handed a knife. For the first months, everyone waited for disaster. Boyle was sullen, suspicious, hostile. He'd spent years in solitary, years where the only human contact was violence. The idea that he could just create something, that art could matter to a man who'd blinded another human being, it seemed absurd. Then something shifted. Boyle started working with clay, just touching it at first, then shaping it. Small, crude forms that meant nothing to anyone else. But he kept going, day after day, returning to the material like it was offering him something he couldn't name. He moved to sculpture, figurative work that depicted twisted, agonized human forms, bodies in pain, faces contorted. These weren't beautiful sculptures. They were brutal, raw expressions of confinement, rage, guilt, and something else. Something that looked like it might be remorse. Art was the first non-violent language I ever learned. Boyle said later, the work was powerful enough that people outside the prison started noticing. Artists, critics, gallery owners. Boyle's sculptures began appearing in exhibitions, not as curiosity pieces from a convicted murderer, but as legitimate art evaluated on its own merits. And they were good. Scottish institutions acquired his work. Private collectors paid real money. Jimmy Bole, the man who threw acid in a guard's face, was becoming recognized as a serious sculptor. But the transformation wasn't just artistic. It was psychological. In 1977, Boyle published his autobiography, A Sense of Freedom. The book was raw, unflinching, and controversial. He described his crimes, his violence, his mindset during those years of uncontrolled rage. He didn't excuse himself. He explained himself. The book became a sensation, not just in crime literature, but in criminology, sociology, and penal reform studies. Here was a primary source, a man who'd lived the most extreme version of criminal violence, describing it from the inside. He co-wrote a stage play called The Hard Man, a semi-autobiographical work that toured Scotland. Critics praised it. Audiences were fascinated and repulsed in equal measure. Jimmy Bole was no longer just a prisoner. He was a cultural figure, and that created a problem. The public backlash was fierce and immediate. Victims' rights groups protested. "Where's the victim's art?" they asked. "Where's the blind guard's sculpture exhibition?" The families of those Boyle had hurt and allegedly murdered watched as he received praise, recognition, even respect. He doesn't deserve redemption, critics argued. He destroyed lives. He should be forgotten in a cell, not celebrated in a gallery. The supporters countered. This is proof that rehabilitation works. If Boyle can change, anyone can change. Both sides had a point, and neither would back down. Eventually, after serving years in the special unit and then in lower security facilities, Jimmy Bole was released. Not pardoned, not exonerated. Released under a life license, meaning any criminal offense would send him immediately back to prison for the rest of his life. He walked out into a Scotland that didn't know what to make of him. Some saw him as a success story, evidence that even the most violent offenders could transform if given the right environment and opportunity. Proof that the system could be more than punishment, it could be reformation. Others saw him as proof that the system had failed, that a man who'd committed such horrific acts of violence had been rewarded with opportunities most law-abiding citizens never received, that his victims had been forgotten while he became famous. Boyle continued his art. He lived quietly, staying out of trouble, meeting the terms of his license. He became an occasional voice in debates about penal reform, though he largely stayed out of the public eye. The guard he blinded never recovered his sight. The families of those he hurt never got their loved ones back. Hugh Babs Rooney remained dead, and Boyle maintained his innocence of that murder to this day. The Barley Special Unit, the experiment that changed Boyle's life, was eventually closed. Too controversial, too expensive, too politically difficult to defend when crime rates were rising and voters demanded tougher sentences. So what do we make of Jimmy Bole? He's not a hero. He's not redeemed in any simple sense. The violence he committed left permanent scars, physical, psychological, and social. The man he blinded didn't get to sculpt his way to a new identity. The families he destroyed didn't get book deals, but he's also not quite a villain anymore, because something changed, whether it was genuine transformation or simply learning to channel violence into a different form is a question even Boyle himself might not be able to answer. The truth is probably uncomfortable for everyone involved. Boyle likely is a different person than he was in 1977. The rage that defined him for decades seems to have been redirected, if not extinguished. Art gave him something violence never could: control, meaning, and status without destroying others. But that doesn't erase what he did. It doesn't make the victims whole. It doesn't mean justice was fully served. Jimmy Bole remains a living contradiction. A man who embodied violence so completely that he seemed beyond humanity, who then became something else. Not better, necessarily, just different. He proved rehabilitation is possible. He proved it comes at a cost most people aren't willing to pay. He proved that even the most damaged people can change. And he proved that change doesn't mean forgiveness. The question that haunts his story isn't whether he transformed. It's whether that transformation matters more than what he did before it. Whether society should celebrate someone's redemption or remember their victims. Whether we can hold both truths at once, that he's not the same man who threw acid, and that he's still the man who threw acid. There's no clean answer. Just a man, now in his 80s, living under the permanent shadow of his past. Still creating. Still alive. Still free, but never truly free. Jimmy Bole never became the monster his early life seemed to promise. Instead, he became something far more complicated. Proof that humans are capable of both unimaginable cruelty and unexpected transformation. And the world still doesn't know what to do with that dot. This is for informational and storytelling purposes only, not professional, legal, or personal advice. A big thanks to all my subscribers. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button for more Scottish crime history. And if you think redemption matters, or if you think it doesn't, let me know in the comments below.